Hi, are we all systems go? Oh, no sound. Okay.
Hello, Julie.
Okay, it's 4 o'clock. Hello and welcome to the new Models for Social Justice and Police Reform Question and Answer Part 2. This program is jointly sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Oakland and the League of Women Voters of Piedmont. I am Laurel Plemier, the president of the League of Women Voters of Piedmont, and we're very grateful for everyone who was able to take the time out of your day today to be with us virtually here this afternoon. Before we get to the introduction of our speaker today, I just wanted to go over a few logistics. You can post your questions now or at any time during the presentation in the comments on YouTube, or by emailing them if you'd rather be private to lwvpiedmont@gmail.org. And I will ask as many of them as I can as time allows of our speaker. And just remember that there's a little bit of delay in email getting through, so don't wait till the very last minute. And also, if you'd like to join our mailing list to get notifications about future events, you can do so through our website, which is lwvpiedmont.org. And I'll post a link in the YouTube comments. And I'll invite League of Women Voters of Oakland can do the same thing. So without further ado, I will turn things over to Lois. She is our action chair at the League of Women Voters of Piedmont, and she will introduce our speaker today.
Well, first of all, welcome, Anna. I want to give props to our friend, retired officer Reginald Lyles, for making this connection. He was instrumental, as you well know, in creating the police oversight both for BART and for Oakland. He's a retired officer from Berkeley and Nevada, and he said you'd be a good person to have talk with us. So, Anna, your short history: she's a 25-year Oakland resident. She has worked as a union organizer with various workers under the labor laws, and some of which had no right to unionize. Her background includes workers' rights education, legislative campaigns, fundraising, website development, social media, and I would just say an all-round rabble-rouser. Thank you for being with us. She began volunteering with the Coalition for Police Accountability in 2016, and then worked on a ballot measure so that we could actually have this program in place. Thank you and welcome.
Do you want me just to jump in?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay.
And I don't know if you have slides. If you need to share slides and need help with that, let me know. Okay.
I do not.
Okay.
So I'm with the Coalition for Police Accountability, which is an Oakland based organization. The Oakland Police Department has been under federal monitorship for 17 years now. No end in sight. And in 2016, we put a measure on the ballot to create a police oversight body. There was one that was very ineffective, had no real control, it could just make recommendations. And in the middle of our campaign, and as we were debating with the city council about how much authority the oversight body should have, there was a national scandal that was reported on nationally about Oakland police officers trafficking an underage girl. It had the collateral effect of ensuring that we ended up with the strongest oversight body of a police agency anywhere in the country, because nothing kind of fixes a politician's mind on the need to strengthen oversight as being in the New York Times every day. So we have a police commission that can write policy for the Oakland Police Department. They can hire and fire officers, and they can fire the chief of police, as they recently did. The only challenge about having the police commission is that it's been an ongoing struggle for resources and around their independence. There are certainly folks within the city that continue to want to undermine their ability to function independently. And as a result of that, they haven't always had the level of resources that they were supposed to have under the charter amendment that was voted on by 83% of the voters. And so sometimes the coalition has stepped in a little bit. And one of the times that we stepped in was in February of 2019. The police commission is supposed to have public hearings on any topic every year, but they had no staff. And so we decided to hold a hearing on policing in the unhoused community. One of the things that had happened the year before is that our police officers had been called to a scene where a man was sleeping in between two houses, and there was a gun nearby. And over about 40 minutes, they couldn't come up with a plan of what to do. And eventually they started to wake him up. And as soon as he started to move, they shot him to death. One of the things that came out of that is that as there were some meetings and people came to talk about the murder of Joshua Pollock, a lot of advocates from the unhoused community who had known him, outreach workers, people who worked in the community and knew him, just came to say, we don't understand. We know how to disarm people. And we don't understand. You had a tank, you had so many officers, and you couldn't figure out what to do with somebody who was sleeping. And it was really interesting for those of us who don't necessarily talk to homeless outreach workers every day, just to hear their perspective and to hear some of what they talked about doing on a daily basis as outreach workers. So then we organized this hearing on policing in the unhoused community in February of 2019. And about 65 unhoused residents from throughout Oakland came and just talked about their experiences of being policed within Oakland. And it was very clear that it was an overwhelmingly negative set of interactions that were happening. And that it often didn't solve the original problem. And it kind of created a whole nest of additional problems. So one of the things that we heard throughout all of the testimony was sometimes we do have problems, and sometimes there is an emergency, and sometimes we do need somebody to call, but not the police. There has to be other solutions to these things. So after that, one of our members ran across an article about a group in Eugene, Oregon, who for the past 30 years has been responding to emergency calls. They're dispatched by the police with a counselor and an EMT. And they respond to calls like welfare checks. In Oakland, we get about 5,000 welfare check calls a year. If you follow policing news, Tatiana Jefferson died after a welfare check, and it's actually not uncommon. When police go to, all they're being asked to do is make sure everything's okay in the house, and somehow things go from that to somebody who's supposed to be inside the house being shot. And so in Eugene, Oregon, the program is called Cahoots, and they respond to welfare checks. They respond to calls about a sleeping homeless person. They respond to neighborhood disputes, a wide variety of calls. Some are very mildly criminal in the way that, for example, public urination is technically criminal. But largely these are nonviolent, low-level calls. And what's interesting is they've been doing it for 30 years in Eugene, Oregon, and the police would not have it any other way. Police officers routinely say that they can't imagine having to work in a city that doesn't have a Cahoots model in place, because most officers that you talk to will say something along the lines of, we're not social workers, and they find calls that require them to spend an hour shuttling back and forth between neighbors who are having a dispute to be an incredible suck on their time. And they're also frustrated because they don't feel that they've got the resources really to address the situation and to kind of offer any good referrals. So we had the folks from Eugene, Oregon come down and make some presentations to the community, to providers of services to the community. They met with the mayor, they met with the police, fire, and dispatch. And they just explained kind of what their program was and how it works. What was most surprising to me was their meeting with the police and fire and dispatch. It was not an easy meeting to organize. But when we tried to end the meeting, we couldn't get the police and the fire and the dispatchers to leave. They just kept talking to the people from Cahoots, because the people from Cahoots very clearly understand what policing is and how it works, and they understand dispatch very well. They're very conversant. They don't look very much like police officers. They have tongue piercings and tattoos up their neck, but they speak this kind of shared language. And it was a very interesting thing to watch. So they came and they made presentations, and what the city of Eugene and what the police department of Eugene say is that they save millions of dollars a year, because counselors and EMTs cost less than police and fire, and they resolve things better. There are fewer arrests for kind of the low-level arrests that tend to happen. And then there's a lot of downstream savings as well. If you don't arrest somebody, if somebody's not going to the emergency room when they don't have to go to the emergency room, there are a lot of additional savings that accumulate. And so the city council at that point put $40,000 in their budget, and they asked Urban Strategies Council, which is a local policy group in Oakland, to do a report on the feasibility of implementing a pilot that was similar to Cahoots. And so that's what Urban Strategies has spent the last year doing. The report is out, and it is in the budget, which now is going to be revoted on a little bit, but it's basically in the budget for there to be a pilot of a Cahoots type model for Oakland. It took a year really to study it because we're not Eugene, Oregon. And Eugene, Oregon's been doing it so long, they don't really remember anymore how it's, like, the people who started it are no longer with the program after 30 years. So we needed to look at Oakland, and we needed to look at what was going to work in Oakland, and what the specific needs of Oakland were, and what the specific resources and referrals and services that were available in Oakland were. As it stands now, the pilot is named MACRO, which is Mobile Assistance Community Responders of Oakland. And the council has asked for there to be 2 locations for pilots. And the structure of the pilot, we kind of expect it to be, although the city department that is going to implement the pilot will have final say. Is the model is that we're going to be using people as much from the community as possible that they are serving. For the counselor position, the EMT as well. We're very lucky. There happens to be in the county an EMT training program that produces very high caliber EMTs who were formerly involved in the youth justice system. And many of them really want to be able to give back to their communities, and we're excited to be able to hopefully hire some of them. And then a counselor, and the point of the counselor is they'll have some combination of experience doing similar work as an outreach worker, as a mental health or drug counselor, and they'll have some kind of education, not any required degrees. And then we'll provide excellent training. The essential skill set is people who are very good at de-escalation, who have very strong people skills, who are good problem solvers. And then obviously the EMT comes with their own certification. And that they like the work, because that's, I think, going to be important. So it's not, we're not looking at a clinician model. There are a lot of models where clinicians are responding as an alternative to police or co-responding with police to emergency mental health calls. And if it's a very clear mental health call, that may very well be appropriate. The clinician is likely able to hold somebody on an involuntary hold for 72 hours, which is called 5150, and do things like that. But the low-level calls in Oakland it's largely a matter of addressing the need that's in front of you. You're not diagnosing anybody, you're not medicating anybody, you're not coming up with a long-term care plan, right? And those are all the functions that a clinician would be involved in. Instead, what you're doing is you're dealing with the person in front of them, and the program is completely voluntary, so a person can choose simply not to engage with the team. That's important just in terms of the community knowing that that they always have that option. But it's also why the team doesn't really need to have that clinical capacity. And so you have a team, it has to be 24 hours so people know that it's always available, and it's dispatched through the Oakland dispatch, which is the OPD dispatch. And so what they're doing then is they're looking for the calls that need a response, but they don't really need a badge and a gun. They need somebody who can go and can help somebody work things out. And if a referral is appropriate, they can give them a ride to a referral. If they really do need to go to the emergency room and it's not something that the EMT can help them with, like wound care or something minor, they can give them a ride to the emergency room. And one piece of it is what's called a warm handoff. So instead of just dropping somebody, you make sure that they're settled at the referral before you leave. One of the things that we've learned from the folks in Eugene is you have to be able to do things like figure out what you're going to do with somebody's possessions. If an unhoused person says that they are willing to go to a referral, you've got to be able to figure out what to do with their possessions or their pet so that they'll be able to actually engage with the referral. And so you figure those kinds of things out as well as part of the problem solving. And what it also does is it enables the police to focus more on the types of calls that in Oakland often don't get the attention that residents would like them to get, which is the more serious calls, and spending more time and more resources in kind of solving crimes rather than responding to these thousands of low-level calls that they receive. So I can keep going or I can take questions. It's a little weird just to keep talking to people. Tell me what you want me to do.
If you have more information for us, that's fine. Or if you'd rather start a dialogue, we can do that too.
I can keep talking, but I'm sure I'll get it in if anybody has any questions.
We have a few questions to start. So the first question is, what if the counselor, the EMT, I'm not sure exactly what their, what your official name is going to be for them. If they go to the location and then the situation escalates, what happens, like, what's the protocol for that, and how often has that happened historically, like with the Cahoots program?
So I mean, these are folks that are carrying a police radio. And it's actually part of their safety system is that they have a police radio. It has usually an emergency button on it, because they're being dispatched by OPD. But that's pretty much the extent of the relationship. It's important for the community to know that when these folks show up, they're not kind of police extenders, and they're not reporting back to the police, that it's a separate engagement that you're having with them. But so in Eugene, they take about 20,000 calls a year, and they call for police backup. I think it's 125 times a year on average. So it's a very, very small number of times that they're calling and saying, this is a situation better handled by police. But if that happens, then you would do that. I mean, these are folks that are very, very good at de-escalating. So getting a situation to escalate is kind of not part of their playbook.
So they're kind of coming from a completely different place than what we're historically used to police officers coming
Yes.
from.
So they look different. They're wearing polo shirts, and they're coming, I mean, in Eugene, their van, they work out of a clinic that's called the White Bird Clinic. So they pull up in a white van that has a picture of a bird on the side, and they're wearing polo shirts, you know, and jeans, and they're carrying a backpack, and everybody knows that this is Cahoots and it's not the police, and that your interaction with Cahoots is voluntary, but they're also very good at what they do. So most people do interact with them. But I mean, I think the classic situation where they would call for backup is if they realized that they were dealing with a person who was genuinely either going to harm themselves or harm somebody else, which is the definition of when you put an involuntary hold on somebody. They can't do that, right? Because all interactions with them are voluntary. So in that instance, if you understand that somebody is actually harmful to themselves or others, then you would call and you would say, if the county has a program where clinicians respond, and that's exactly the kind of situation where clinicians should be responding. So if they're available, and if not them, then it is going to be OPD. But that's fairly unusual.
The next question is about funding and where the funding comes from and how that affects the funding of the OPD.
So, you know, we started talking about this a year ago, when defund was not quite on everybody's lips. But one of the things that was most attractive to us about this model, aside from the fact that we think it's the best model out there and that it works really well, is that we had to get some initial money for the pilots, but the intent is that once the pilots have demonstrated that they are doing public safety work in Oakland, they will be funded out of the public safety budget. They will be responding to both emergency and non-emergency calls that come into the Oakland Police Department. And that's the public safety funding. So one of the things that was most attractive to us is to kind of separate it from all of these many really good programs that are doing all kinds of important community stuff, but are always scrambling for money. Because in Oakland, an awful lot of the budget is in public safety. Here's a way to use that money as effectively as it is possible and to ensure that there are better outcomes. I mean, one of the problems for police is, you know, what's the saying? If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. They aren't provided necessarily with that many resources to solve some very intractable social problems. And it often happens that at that point, they get to a point where they say, okay, this person's not complying. And if you're not complying, then you get arrested. The number of people in Santa Rita that have mental health problems is really, really phenomenal. And it's not a good solution for them. It's not a good solution for the city. It's incredibly expensive for everybody. And the chances are really good that you actually made whatever the mental health problem was going in much worse by their interaction with the system. What we have found is that for our unhoused community, which all indications are is going to get a lot larger post-COVID, just because of the economy, is that being arrested for anything means that not only did you lose your tent and all of your possessions, you likely lost your spot in an encampment. So if you were in a place that was a good place to be and you knew the people around you and it was fairly safe, by the time you come back, somebody else is in that spot. You've likely lost paperwork. So if you were applying for any kind of assistance or any social service stuff, or trying to get a new driver's license, or any of the many things that are incredibly challenging for unhoused people, you've now lost all of that paperwork and you're going to have to start over. Plus just the trauma of being arrested and going to Santa Rita, and now you get exposed to COVID along the way. It's, so there's just, it's kind of this cascading effects that impact people. And what we've found is that the low-level arrests are not only incredibly expensive for the city, they take hours of police time, and then there's additional OPD administrative time, and then there's county time, and then there's the county costs of somebody in jail, and then there's a tremendous number of community costs, because the likelihood is that if the person had a job, they've lost it. Their family members end up spending a good deal of money in terms of supporting the person who's in jail or getting them out of jail and putting up bail, which you don't get back. So, I mean, there's just, it's incredibly harmful for the entire community in terms of that approach. The other thing I just wanted to mention is that often the calls get discussed as mental health calls. And it's certainly true that a lot of them do have a mental health component to them. But a lot of them, you don't know if there's mental health issues, or it's just somebody didn't have anywhere to sleep and they curled up in the doorway. And then pretty soon somebody's trying to open that store and they call and they say, we need, somebody's asleep and I want them moved, right? Could be mental health, could not be mental health. So a lot of the calls are just fairly low level calls. If you talk to police officers, they'll tell you that the calls they get calls sometimes from parents whose kids won't get up and go to school. And you don't necessarily need a gun for that, hopefully.
Can you speak a little bit about how anti-bias training will be integrated into the program?
It's foundational. I think it will be foundational in terms of the training and making sure that folks are very open to meeting people where they're at, right? Wherever that is, in terms of all of the different ways that people express themselves or are represented. We expect, because it's non-clinician, we're very interested in removing as many barriers as possible to employment. In the Bay Area, we have a phenomenal pool of people who have come out of San Quentin. And one of the interesting things about San Quentin is they have really good programming at San Quentin. If you're in any of the other state prisons, your focus is to get transferred to San Quentin because they have exceptional programming there, right? And we get a lot of the folks coming out of San Quentin in the Bay Area. And I was talking to a guy the other day who was telling me about this college brain science class he took. And so there's a whole group of these folks who they took counseling classes. They became drug counselors for other people while they were still at San Quentin. They became all kinds of mentors and leaders. And then they got out and they've spent a couple of years helping other people who were coming out of prison, or they were doing counseling, or they became outreach workers, because due to both housing and employment discrimination, a lot of our unhoused people are formerly incarcerated. And so they've spent several years doing work that's kind of parallel to the work that we're looking at. And obviously everybody's going to be trained, so everybody's kind of doing it the same way and has the same, everybody's got the same information. But there are a lot of people in our community who are from the communities that the pilots will be in, and will be helping their own communities. So that doesn't mean that you don't need anti-bias training, because there's lots of different biases, but it's very foundational to the program that the idea is you're meeting people where they are and you're considering them to be the experts of their own lives, and you're helping to figure out with them what to do. But it's voluntary, and it's within that context.
You've talked a lot about unhoused individuals, and the question is, what is the data? I mean, obviously it would be different in Oakland versus the Cahoots program, but what is the data on how this program is used with unhoused individuals versus the rest of the community? If there's any data on that, and what percentage falls within which category?
Cahoots was unable to give us data about, they can tell us what types of calls they respond to, but they can't tell us like who was unhoused versus who was not as a data set. They can tell us generally that they work a lot with the unhoused community. They work a lot with folks who do have some mental health issues, and they work a lot with people who are drug users. And those aren't three separate groups completely, but they also answer calls really from anybody in the community. Many families have had some situations where it would have been good to have somebody to call, whether they're housed or unhoused. But it's hard to give you the numbers. And I've tried to get kind of some statistics in Oakland about how many calls, or how many, even like how many low-level arrests that happen in Oakland are of unhoused people. And what OPD says is that they do not track arrests based on whether people are housed or not. We're very hopeful that if we could get some researchers interested in it, that if there are ways that we think that you could kind of get the data by like looking at arrest records and see what's written on the home address line, which sometimes they write vagrant, and that's a pretty good clue. Or if the address that's listed is a homeless encampment. I mean, we think there might be some ways to quantify some of this, but currently it's not tracked. It would definitely be a significant portion of the work, but it's not all of the work. This isn't just about responding in unhoused communities. I will tell you, however, that the unhoused communities are really, really interested in having some response that's not police, because their interactions with police are overwhelmingly negative. One of the problems is that there's a lot of folks in the unhoused community who have outstanding warrants. And they're not for big things. It's what happens when, it's kind of hard to keep track of everything and paperwork. And so you don't show up in court for something that's fairly minor, and now you've got an outstanding warrant. So that's another problem for them, is that it doesn't matter what the interaction is for. You can't call the police because you found a dog if you have an outstanding warrant. So it definitely would be a large portion of it, and the locations that they're looking at for doing the pilots would definitely have unhoused folks in them. I mean, the thing that's very attractive about the pilots is you could start in a very small area and then you can grow it out. You don't have to one day say, okay, we're going citywide tomorrow. You can just continue to grow it out. And so it's kind of, it's how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. You can kind of broaden this out one bite at a time.
I have my own follow-up to what you just said about if you have a warrant out and you are hesitant to call the police, can you call, like, if you're calling 911, you're going to get to the police anyway, wouldn't you still be hesitant to call 911, or is there an easy way to access this program directly and something that the community would know about and be able to do?
So that's kind of the challenge, is that you can either educate the community about it's okay to call 911 and ask for macro, or you can educate the community, here's another number. Right? Either way, you've got to educate the community. What has happened over time in Eugene is that people tend to call the non-emergency line. So if you're going to educate people to call, at least get them off the emergency line, because if it's not a heart attack, best to leave the 911 for heart attacks. And then there's some discussion about creating a whole separate number. Still within dispatch, the dispatch could just answer as macro. If people really wanted macro or nothing, where you answer it as macro and you say, look, if macro's not available, do you want no response? So that they would have that option. But the police don't check if you call the police about warrants or anything else. So they might be concerned about it. The greater likelihood is that they're concerned about it because they've had negative interactions with the police previously.
You mentioned somebody calling the police because their kid wouldn't get up and go to school. Would this group respond to child welfare checks or to domestic violence calls, or is that above the threshold?
So the domestic violence, the anti-domestic violence community in Oakland, whenever I talk about them, it ends up sounding like they're advocating for domestic violence. They have responses that they've worked out with the police over time, and they're not really interested in being part of a brand new pilot. They, I think, would for the most part like to keep the responses the way it is right now, and let this pilot start. The police are also very concerned about domestic violence calls because they're kind of notorious as being potentially some of the most violent. For right now, I'd say not domestic violence calls, which are distinguished from sometimes there are family arguments that really aren't domestic violence, but it's more of a, my kid took the car without permission kinds of things. Which again, if you can keep it from a situation where there's a report filed and now you've got a kid with a charge against them, may be advantageous, right? So I think domestic violence, at least in terms of the pilot, is very clearly outside of the realm. One of the advantages of having non-clinician responses is in a lot of communities, the history with clinicians has not always been good. There are folks who show up and make a lot of judgments about your life and your children and how things are going. And even if your children stay in your house, they're going to have a lot of requirements about classes that they want you to take, and they're going to come in and they're going to keep inspecting your house. And if you've had a mental health problem and clinicians have you've either engaged with clinicians previously or you've been 5150 previously, people just have a lot of history of people not necessarily respecting them as their own advocates and their own experts on their own lives. And so it's a real advantage in some ways not to come in with all of that historical baggage as well. One other thing I wanted to mention about these jobs is that from an economic justice perspective, one of the things that we are very strongly advocating for is that these need to be very good jobs. Not only will it help the program because you'll have less turnover, it will be a stressful enough job without having the people who are in it worrying too much about money. We want to ensure that they make enough that they can continue to live in Oakland. Oakland has had a major diaspora from Oakland to the surrounding suburbs because people couldn't afford it anymore. And also because if you're we're not really replacing police officers, but if you're displacing a police response, those are highly paid people. And if we're going to save money by replacing them with folks who are a more appropriate response, we don't want to save all of that money on their backs, right? If we're going to recruit people from communities, you strengthen communities by putting good jobs in those communities. So we're very focused on making sure folks like EMTs really don't get paid a lot. It's kind of shockingly low. And if you've ever been in a situation where an EMT was staunching your arterial blood, you don't think they get paid enough. So we really want to make sure that we're valuing the jobs as very important jobs as we kind of develop the program.
What kind of training would be necessary for current police officers to integrate with the program?
The main training is actually for dispatch. Dispatch needs to feel very, very comfortable about which kinds of calls they're sending to macro versus sending to police. The advantage from dispatch's perspective in sending something to police is police are viewed as kind of factotums. They can do anything. They can take a report on a lost dog, or they can handle a hostage situation where somebody's holding a gun, right? They can, and so they're an appropriate response to anything. And so you're asking dispatchers to now start to think about calls in terms of what can safely be given to somebody without a badge and a gun, based on the information that you have. So dispatchers need training. Police, more or less, again, the advantage of starting with a pilot is you're only going to have 1 or 2 precincts involved. And so you can literally kind of have some initial conversations with them at the beginning of their shift when everybody's together, talk to them a little bit about the program. I will tell you that I was at a neighborhood police meeting recently on Zoom, of course. And the lieutenant who was on was like, wait, how can I get the pilot to be in my area, right? Police, you don't have to talk to them very much before they understand that these are the calls that just suck an incredible amount of their time and their effort and really leave them frustrated as well because they don't have good resources or referrals to suggest to people, and they'd really rather be solving more complex situations.
A win-win.
Yes.
What metrics are you looking at for evaluating the success of the pilot program and how to move forward with it?
So I'm trying to take a challenge and turn it into an advantage. OPD does not actually track outcomes of their calls. So they know how many calls they get and they know how many calls they respond to, but they don't know what happens after that? So that means that whatever metrics we create, we've got the only metrics. Seems to be the answer. We have an advantage because we've got a blank piece of paper, and we are going to make sure that there is a system that is both fairly easy for the people in the field and gets us the data in structures that will work in terms of figuring out both what kinds of calls, how long calls take, and what the outcome of calls are. Then we'll have data. I actually, it just so happens that several data guys have called me in the last couple of weeks and said that they wanted to help. And I was like, oh, yay. Could you figure out what we should be tracking here, say? So, I mean, somebody has to figure that out. Fortunately, it's not me. But we have a blank piece of paper, and that's a tremendous advantage. Is if you've never done it, you get to do it right from the first time. This is a 1-year pilot. So the plan is that we will do 3-month like snapshot reports of how things are going. And then at the end of the year, the question is whether the pilot needs to continue until enough data is collected and there's some kind of conclusion or what the next steps are. But so it's a 1-year pilot. It'll be in 2 locations. And I mean, I think basically it's like if they are responding to enough, you know, I suppose everybody could stop calling 911 and they could not have calls to respond to. I mean, if they're responding to calls and these are calls that are getting successfully handled, if they were for some reason calling for police backup 90% of the time, that would be a clear failure. But if they can respond to calls and respond effectively and take these calls out of the dispatch for OPD and, by the way, the fire department, then I think it's a success.
You had talked in the very beginning about there being a budget for a cahoots type model in Oakland. Has the pilot been approved by the city council, and is the police commission also involved, and have they approved?
So the police commission does not approve budgets. The police commission obviously has been kind of aware of this and supportive of this really from its inception. And so we go back and report to them. It is in the current city budget as it's approved. There's going to be some minor modifications coming up, I believe, on Tuesday, but we don't really expect for there to be any significant changes to the macro piece of the budget. So we think it's budgeted, and then the plan is to be able to shift some of that money for future funding from the public safety budget after it's proved itself.
Have you been in communication with other communities in the Bay Area about similar programs?
Oh, yes.
Can you elaborate?
Oakland is just in a very unique situation because all of a sudden, all of the jurisdictions are looking at how they can figure out some kind of alternative response in terms of policing. And we started doing this in June of 2019 in terms of like starting to do some serious research about it through Urban Strategies. So everybody, I mean, like you read in the paper where London Breed says we're going to create an alternative response system. And then a couple of days later, London Breed's office calls and says, wait, how did you do that? So there's a report from Urban Strategies that we've been sending around a good deal. We've been getting calls from congressional offices asking what should be the federal support for this. The Peralta colleges just voted not to continue their sheriffs. They have a contract with the sheriff's office that basically provides their security. And they just voted that they're going to curtail that contract after 6 months. So they're figuring out what to do. And they were asking kind of about the macro model or what they should do. We've heard from Fremont, San Francisco, Contra Costa, Walnut Creek, and then folks from other places will be talking to Chicago later this week. So there's a lot of interest and it's all great. We're encouraging people as much as possible to think about the very specific pieces of the model that we believe would be best, which is a non-clinician model. So there is few barriers as possible to employment of the right people. And really, you go out in the community and you start talking to people about the skills that are needed to do this work. And people can tell you who in their community does that, kind of keeping it on a non-clinician, as a non-clinician model, keeping it as reflective of the community as possible and responsive to the community as possible, and ensuring that they're good jobs. And we're just encouraging people to at least consider those aspects of a model if they're going to do it. We will also keep suggesting to people that what would really make a lot of sense is to have some regional approach, because there's definitely kind of opportunities of scale and sharing information and sharing resources. The Peralta community is interested in starting some training so I'm now mentioning Peralta twice, and it's two separate things, right? One is they're figuring out what to do for security if they don't hire the sheriffs. And they're interested in starting some classes for people who would be doing alternative responses, right? And anything that enables these response models to share resources and to support each other, I think would be incredibly beneficial. And we've been saying to everybody that, if we're the first on the ground, then we think everybody should come and do ride-alongs with our folks once our folks know what they're doing, right? So, anything that we can do to support that on a regional level, I think will be very beneficial for everybody.
What is your timeline for implementing the program and how far along are you in that timeline?
Well, the first step was to get it in the budget, which we believe it's in the budget. And after Tuesday, it will be officially a budget that can no longer be changed. We're very lucky because Oakland has a new Department of Violence Prevention, and the chief and the deputy chief of that new department are really, really folks with deep skills. And we were very lucky to get them. They're a little overwhelmed right now because suddenly a Department of Violence Prevention sounds like a good idea for almost everything that's happening in Oakland. But fortunately, macro was placed within the DVP. There's always some bureaucracy to work out in terms of whether it's a contract with a nonprofit, whether it's done as a city project. Sometimes it takes the city a while to hire people. If it has to be put out to bid, things like that. But if things went perfectly, you could have vans in the street in October or November.
what are the biggest challenges that you have faced, and what do you foresee in the future as challenges to actually implementing the program?
Well, COVID was a bummer. So one of the things that happened is that in the past couple of months after George Floyd, there was a lot more attention on macro as a pilot, and 10 times that much attention in Eugene, Oregon on their program of the past 30 years. So I used to like be able to get on the phone really, really quickly with the folks in Eugene, who we were hoping would be able to support us a lot in our rollout. We still think that we'll be able to bring them down to do the training with the dispatchers, for example. Dispatchers like to be trained with a lot of examples of situations, right? And then you discuss the situation and you pull it all apart and you just, you know, that's what they like to do. And so these are the perfect people to come down and do that training with them, right? Folks who have just seen so many different scenarios that they are very, very fluid about it. And they are now getting many, many calls all the time. So that's a little bit of a challenge. And then the other piece of the challenge is with COVID, it's just less possible to travel. The other jurisdictions that have thought about a project like this will be the first major city, unless Chicago or San Francisco do something with very little, just put it out there. We anticipated maybe sending some folks up to Eugene to do ride-alongs and to do that kind of thing, and we may not be able to do that. Turns out that there's somebody who used to work in Eugene who retired in the Bay Area, and she just called us and said, well, I can help. And I said, well, will you do ride-alongs when they're very new? She said yes. So, I mean, you know, we'll work it out. But there were some logistical challenges there, and there was a certain advantage to people paying a lot less attention to it. When you're trying to get something going, there's a little bit of potential of a Christmas tree effect where everybody wants you to be all things and they just keep hanging ornaments on the project until you kind of tip over. So, you know, there were some advantages to being a very sweet little program that everybody thought sounded nice, but it had a lot less focus on it. But I think that we have pretty solid support for letting it be exactly what it is. And that is that it's not going to address every single problem that's in Oakland right now. It's supposed to do this one very simple thing, which is displace police in responding to certain calls.
Is the pilot going to be for a limited duration, both, you know, is it a year and then we'll reassess and see how it is? And also during the day, is there a limited number of hours, or are you staffing 24/7?
So the expectation is that it would be staffed 24 hours and that it's funded for a year. The expectation, I think, is that at the end of the year, you're figuring out what to do. It's not like, well, we've stopped funding it, we're taking the vans off the street, but it's going well. And we have to figure out both whether we're ready to expand it, whether we're ready to say it's no longer a pilot, it's now a function of the city. And we're going to kind of make it a more permanent thing as we begin to grow it out. I mean, the vision is eventually to have macro teams responding throughout the city for the kinds of calls that can be more appropriately handled without police. And so that's the long-term goal. In Eugene, they answer 1 in 5 emergency calls. So 20% of all emergency calls are handled by non-police. And I was talking to them recently and they said, really, we think we could do more. You know, there are more than, it's more than 20% of the calls. That's just the capacity level that we've been at. And now there's some discussion about how to expand the types of calls that they're responding to. So I think, you know, 20% is kind of the floor of what you can very, very easily respond to without police.
That's surprising. That's a large number. And are the respondents housed in a facility near the police? Is that completely separate? Do you have that in existence in Oakland now?
We don't know if it's going to be a city project or if it's going to be a project that's contracted to a nonprofit. They wouldn't be housed like in a police precinct. They're very separate function. And you know, if you do it right, they complement one another, but they're very distinct in kind of what their scope of work is. In Eugene, there are stories about police officers will be like wrestling with somebody on the ground and the Cahoots van pulls up and they just like get off the person and they say, oh, thank God you're here, and they walk off. I mean, they understand what Cahoots does, and they're very happy to kind of turn over things that they are having some challenges with and just leave it in somebody else's hands. So it's a, you know, I mean, I think that understanding that can be helpful, but it's also important for the community to see them as a distinct group that's not a part of the police and is not going to report back to the police. We have some trust issues in Oakland.
As many communities do. Thank you very much for your time. I'm going to turn over to Viola, who will give us some closing remarks.
Thank you very much. And you were so kind to be so generous with your time and to educate us and the communities and constituencies that we serve. And it's very hard to understand these issues when we have so many disparate opinions about mostly and often not well informed. And so it's great to have someone who's been at it, the game for a while, is knowledgeable about the ins and outs and provide us a perspective that we can gain. I want to thank very much my colleagues at our sister organization, Piedmont League. And I think altogether, the conversation, I think, continues. And it's not just in Oakland, as you say, because as we learn from each other, I think there's a demand now for different models, many resistant to it, fearful about change, not because you didn't see that it needed it, but because they didn't know what might change too. And I think having models that have more structure around them, an understanding of that, and individuals like yourself who are dedicated enough to inform us. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you. I'm going to stop the live stream now.